We have lived in a world which was, back in 1648, created by the Treaty of Westphalen, where sovereign actors, originally sovereign rulers rather than sovereign nation states, were the sole actors who counted or had the right to be counted. Now, in the globalized world of today, the whole concept of absolute sovereignty has become a rather theoretical construction, as interdependence has inevitably eroded its foundation. And the growth of the world's population has irrevocably changed the world, and is the most obvious reason why this interdependence in both good things and bad things is a reality that no one can escape. And it applies to any and all countries, big or small, with or without nuclear weapons, and irrespective of whether they embrace globalization or would want to opt out of it. The world's population has, during my lifetime, grown threefold, from 2.3 billion to 6.9 billion today. And although it is now true that this growth has begun to even out, the number of people on Earth will reach at least 9 or 10 billion before we can attain zero population growth. And this, I underline, means that what was still possible and workable in a world with a few 100 million or even 2 billion people is no longer valid in a world with 7 billion, let alone with more than 9 billion people. And this undermines one of the defining features of the Westphalian Order, namely the use of power politics, including resorting to war to further your national interest, and gain advantage at the cost of other nations or at the cost of the environment. But leaving all moral and ethical considerations aside, one cannot deny that this way of furthering one's national interests and the power politics it has been used as its instrument could, in many cases, bring benefits, at least for limited periods of time. Limited because no empire in history has lasted forever. But the complex nature of today's post-industrial societies make reliance on military power and force more and more unproductive, as software and knowledge, rather than hardware and muscle power, are the key to success and well-being. And in addition, we must also recognize how weapons of mass destruction have changed the scope and context of power politics. But even without resorting to weapons of mass destruction, also the deployment of so-called conventional weapons has drastically changed the nature of war. If the aim of military power, using military power, has been to defend civilians and civilian society, then it has been progressively failing, as casualties in today's wars mainly affect those not in uniform. And this is also the case in Afghanistan, although it is not easy to find reliable figures. If you Google Afghanistan war casualties, you may have to surf the net actually for quite some time before you find any mention of Afghan casualties, let alone exact numbers, whereas every single loss of the American and coalition armed forces is carefully and accurately recorded. Increasing and deepening the international division of labor, which is essentially what globalization means, has brought huge benefits in terms of growth, strengthened potential for the realization of human rights and better environmental management, increasing wealth and well-being. And this has not been only limited to the more well-off parts of the world, that hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of abject poverty, particularly in Asia, would not have been possible without taking advantage of global markets created and opened by globalization. But the challenge with globalization is that these benefits are not distributed equally around the world or inside different societies, with many people becoming distinct losers in this process. And the second huge challenge is exercising democratic control over the processes involved in globalization. In a sense, this means giving an adequate answer to the question, who is in charge? While democracy has never in history been so widespread in terms of both the absolute numbers of people and the relative proportion of all people in the world who can elect or dismiss their governments in more or less free and fair elections, there is also a growing feeling, particularly in the older and established democracies, that democratic elections have become irrelevant, as those elected are not really in charge and increasingly resort to mouthing the slogans of the current Taina doctrine, meaning there is no alternative, which is used to justify whatever is the program of the day of the government in office. Diminishing belief in the possibilities of democracy has led to growing voter apathy on one hand, and an increasing belief in the necessity of and justification for extra-parliamentary activism, which actually doesn't need to be regarded always negatively, as long as it firmly keeps to non-violent methods. Democracy has been essentially a national project, and when the power of national governments to steer the economy have been eroded and taken over by international agreements and organizations and/or anonymous global market forces, they have been perceived to have become impotent. This perception corresponds to reality, even if this impotence has been often exaggerated with the intention of getting electorates to acquiesce more easily in what governments actually have themselves chosen or to dismiss the possibilities for alternative choices. So one conclusion is that globalization calls for global democracy. This does not mean that we could begin to build this with a globally elected world parliament or even end up with a world parliament. We shall have to realistically recognize that global governance will, for the foreseeable future, remain the domain and responsibility of intergovernmental cooperation in existing international organizations. Only the European Union can, with any credibility, claim to have tried to address the issue of bringing democracy into its intergovernmental supranational decision-making. And the EU, in the EU it is, in my opinion, rather the efforts to involve national parliaments of the member states in exercising control over the proceedings and decision-making in the Council, rather than the European Parliament as it exists today, that can enhance the inadequate democratic legitimacy of the Union. I make a specific point of mentioning the EU because I regard the EU at present, with all its well-known faults and shortcomings, which we discussed in the previous panel, as being our best available instrument in endeavoring to achieve better management of globalization and for enhancing global democracy. Global democracy is also served by the emergence of a global civil society and the technologies which have made it much more difficult for authoritarian regimes to control and censor the use of modern communication technology, such as the internet. Global democracy is also enhanced by reforms in international organizations which seek to give both parliamentarians and civil society some sort, even if limited, a mostly advisory role in international organizations and negotiation processes, which remain in the sphere of intergovernmental cooperation. Democracy needs stable and legitimate institutions, but these are not enough. A vibrant civil society, free and accessible media, and a fair distribution of resources for civic and political participation are also necessary requirements. Here, the globalization of civil society can be seen as having developed in some respects further than formal transnational institutions. This said, it should be absolutely clear that there can be no global democracy without democratically ruled countries and states. So far in history, there is not a single example of any genuine democracy worth the name which does not include freely constituted political parties competing with each other in free and fair elections. And I state this categorically, not as an answer to those who in the 20th century used to claim that single-party systems, regimes, whether of the communist, fascist or nationalist variety, were somehow superior to multi-party democracies, which undoubtedly had in many instances rather poor track records in terms of producing stability, well-being and efficient government for their peoples, particularly in the 20s and 30s. In those circumstances, and even after the Second World War, apologists for single-party regimes could also point out how the single parties in almost a mystical way had solved class and other conflicts in their societies by harmoniously bringing together the nation in the only party allowed, usually under the leadership of a wise and benevolent dear leader. And even in today's world, one may find such examples in many places, and not only in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. China is, of course, a much more sophisticated and, at least in economic terms, an even admirably well-run country. But it nevertheless is a non-democratic single-party state. The Chinese regime no longer seeks to justify its continuation primarily in terms of Marxist-Leninist or indeed any other ideology, but rather as a system of government which is not only necessary to achieve undeniable economic success, but is also the only reliable way in which such a vast country can be managed and kept together in a stable manner. But the remark about multi-party democracy is, at least in a European context, no longer needed to stave off calls for single-party regimes. Rather, it is necessary because in most, if not all of our more established democracies in Europe, there is a growing dissatisfaction with democratic institutions in general and with political parties in particular. It is reflected both in falling voter turnouts and in sometimes not so cordial loathing of all political leaders. But not so far in any real demand for replacing democratic institutions with authoritarian or totalitarian regimes without one or more political parties. Most of those dissatisfied with party politics are not calling for single party or other authoritarian solutions. Rather, they wish to see, they are engaged in a sort of wishful hankering for some sort of more direct democracy, which gives a direct voice to its citizens. But however dissatisfied we are, and irrespective of how justified this dissatisfaction is, we should remember that political parties are a necessary condition for any real democracy. Just as parliaments acting as legislators, no matter how corrupt, undeserving, or just plain stupid we may deem them to be. But while parties are a necessary condition, they are not sufficient. Historically, all the Nordic countries have a long tradition of civil society and popular mass movements interacting with the political system. But today's Nordic societies and parties and civil society have undergone substantial changes with participation in these movements and parties eroding clearly. This does not necessarily mean that interest and participation in politics has fallen in a similar manner. And indeed, in, say, apart from Finland, voter participation in elections has remained at a relatively high level in the Nordic countries. Well, as you can surmise, I do feel quite a certain satisfaction and even pride in the Nordic model of political organization and of our welfare state. But we all know that pride comes before a fall, and we cannot put forward any claims about being perfect. So fortunately, for both ourselves and others, none of the Nordic countries are great powers. On the contrary, we are small countries with a total population of 25 million people. We have very open economies, and we can harbor no illusions about using any form of coercion, economic, let alone military, to impose our model on anyone. And we are therefore forced to rely on cultural diplomacy if we wish to make our mark in the world. This is just as well, for the values and principles on human rights and democracy we espouse do not lend themselves for being successfully imposed on others by the sword. Dictators and dictatorial regimes can be overthrown by military intervention, but there is no guarantee that continued military occupation and engagement in civil war will produce enduring freedom or sustainable democracy. At the end of the day, a country's freedom can only be the work of its own people. So where do we stand on Afghanistan? And I believe that this is true also in Afghanistan. All the Nordic countries, NATO and non-NATO, were ready to support the UN resolutions which mandated the action against the Taliban regime after 9/11. As long as Al-Qaeda was entrenched in Afghanistan, there was clearly a case for eliminating this threat, and this was not only a case of solidarity with the US, but also self-interest, as terrorism is a threat to all and any countries in today's world. While supporting the action against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, the Nordic countries and Europeans in general, apart from initially the UK, never subscribed to the American rhetoric about war on terrorism. We felt that this war rhetoric reflected a serious misunderstanding about the nature of the threat terrorism entailed and how to counter it. It also led to costly mistakes in a conflict which could never be resolved only by military means, where body counting the number of so-called eliminated terrorists was the criteria for success. After the fall of the Taliban regime, ISAF was established originally to take care of peacekeeping operations in and around Kabul. Subsequently, it was put under NATO command, expanded to cover the whole country, and finally unified with Operation Enduring Freedom. And this means that the original circumstances and conditions in which prevailed when the Nordic countries originally decided to join the operation have significantly changed. Unlike particularly some of the newer NATO member states, Sweden and Finland, as militarily non-aligned countries, have had no need to show NATO solidarity. For some, in other countries, this may be the only reason to be in Afghanistan, irrespective if many of their people or even their leaders have little or no faith in the success of the mission and are agnostic at best about the more lofty motives for strengthening democracy and human rights as reasons for being in Afghanistan. The mantra of how NATO cannot afford to lose in Afghanistan is, to my mind, dangerous for everyone, also including both NATO and Afghanistan. National prestige and saving face as reasons for continuing military engagements are always to be eschewed, and they do not become more palatable if they are transferred from the national level to that of an alliance. I am not saying that this reasoning is dominant in all NATO countries. nor claiming that Sweden and Finland are wholly free from this thinking either. And it explains why public criticism, private misgivings notwithstanding, have been so far relatively muted, even if the original ISAF peacekeeping operation, which was of a more traditional, albeit of also a more risky and demanding nature than before, which we joined, has been transformed into part of a force engaged in full-scale war. But had this been known at the outset, I think it is extremely unlikely that our parliaments would have agreed to the operation. But now they have so far acquiesced in the mission creep that has since then taken place. If calls for re-evaluating our engagement grow continuously, it is not because of a wimpy distaste for casualties, although concerns for these are not illegitimate either. When we took the original decision to join ISAF, we recognized that this could not be a short-term commitment. And we have been prepared and still are prepared to continue in the operation as long as we feel that we are making a contribution towards peace, stability, respect for human rights, and the consolidation of democracy. But this has to be increasingly questioned. I will not offer any views on the military situation, although that may not be so convincing either and has to be carefully evaluated. But what should we think about Afghan democracy after the massive fraud of the presidential elections and the adoption of a constitution based accommodating Islamic principles, embracing conflict with religious and other freedoms? What should we think about the drug situation, with record numbers of drugs being produced in and exported from the country, with the connivance of also central figures in the administration? And how to evaluate the human rights situation in general and the position of Afghani women in particular? These are questions central not only for the Nordic countries, but also for all of those involved in ISAF. To be sure, on almost every issue, with the possible exception of the drug situation, we can expect the situation to be inexorably worse if an unreconstructed Taliban administration were to return to power. No question of that. But would a negotiated solution putting an end to the war and indiscriminate killing really be worse than a continuation of the present situation? These are hard questions which have to be put on the table in all participating countries, and they have been put on the table, including the US. In principle, these are questions which the international community, within the framework of the United Nations, should answer. And indeed, there have been and will continue to be wide consultations in many multilateral fora and meetings. But at the end of the day, they will not be answered by the UN Security Council, nor indeed by the North Atlantic Council either, but they will be resolved somewhere on the way between the White House and the Pentagon in Washington. And it will mean that other countries too have the obligation to come to their own conclusions irrespective of how they are consulted. For the Nordic countries, the situation is that even if on balance, we still believe that we can make a positive contribution in Afghanistan, we also have to ask whether the limited resources at our disposal are being put to optimal use in Afghanistan, where the Nordic countries have today altogether about 1,800 soldiers. Because at the same time, the Nordic countries have all run down their participation in UN peacekeeping operations, where our experience and expertise are highly valued, and which also would sorely need the Nordic contribution, which only comes up to about 250 today, which is historically the lowest figure since the start of any of UN peacekeeping operations. A Nordic military withdrawal from Afghanistan does not mean abandoning the country and efforts to build democracy and human rights. If we no longer do see a military solution that we could usefully contribute to, we must be prepared to continue and increase our contribution to civilian crisis management and development cooperation in the country. The countries of Central Asia, the former Soviet republics, are different in many respects from Afghanistan. For one thing, they are all members of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which has a central role in monitoring elections, human rights and democracy in these countries. And they are, of course, all rightly concerned about Afghanistan and the possible contagion of radical Islamic fundamentalism, but this does not make them vulnerable to any domino effect. For them too, continuing war, rather than the nature of the Afghanistan government, is the biggest threat to peace, stability, and ultimately democracy in these countries. The Central Asian countries are hardly models of democracy and human rights, but they have all subscribed to the principle of the OSCE and other commitments, and they should be consistently engaged on this by the international community. By consistency, I mean resisting the often occurring temptation to turn a blind eye on violations of these principles when important economic, trade, or even arms trade or larger geopolitical interests are involved. And I can only express the pious hope that the Nordic countries are at least slightly more immune to these temptations than some other countries. To make a rather provocative conclusion, Afghanistan is a country which has suffered from malign neglect. This was particularly the case up to in the civil wars up to 2001, when neighboring countries and more faraway countries were both arming and financing one party or another. Not because they necessarily identified or liked that party, but because it caused discomfort for those who were arming and financing the other party. Now, since then, we can ask if Afghanistan today is a country suffering from benign intervention. If we take all of the motives for our continued engagement in Afghanistan at their face value, even if all this were true, there is still the old truth that the way to hell is paved with good intentions. Thank you.